At 10:20 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Lieutenant Commander Wade McCluskey was running out of fuel and out of options. 20,000 feet below, the Pacific stretched in every direction, empty, featureless, merciless. Somewhere out there, for Japanese aircraft carriers were steaming toward Midway Island with enough striking power to destroy what remained of America's Pacific Fleet. McCluskey's mission was to find them and sink them. He had found nothing. For nearly 2 hours, he had led 31 SBD Dauntless dive bombers southwest across that empty ocean, navigating by dead reckoning toward coordinates that should have held the Japanese fleet. The coordinates were wrong. The Japanese had changed course, and now McCluskey faced the brutal arithmetic of naval aviation. His fuel gauges told him what his orders could not. Turn back now or ditch in the ocean. Every mile he flew forward was a mile he might not have for the return. McCluskey was a fighter pilot by training, not a dive bomberman. He had been promoted to command Enterprise's air group just 2 months before the battle. He had never led a major strike against enemy warships. The tactical manuals were clear. When fuel reached a certain point, you went home. The mission came second to bringing your men back alive. But McCluskey understood something else. If he turned back now, the Japanese carriers would reach Midway. They would destroy the island's defenses, and then they would hunt down the American carriers one by one, just as they had hunted the Prince of Wales and Repulse, the Langley, and the Hermes. Every Allied warship that had dared to face the Kido Butai in the past 6 months had been destroyed. He had to find them. He had to find them now. McCluskey made a decision that Admiral Nimitz would later call the moment that decided the fate of our carrier task force and our forces at Midway. He turned northwest. In the next 40 minutes, McCluskey would find the Japanese fleet. And in the 5 minutes after that, American dive bombers would destroy 3 aircraft carriers and shatter an empire's assumptions about its own invincibility. The aircraft that delivered this destruction was the Douglas SBD Dauntless, a machine the Japanese had dismissed as slow, obsolete, and irrelevant. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The 6 months between Pearl Harbor and Midway had been the most spectacular run of military conquest in modern naval history. Japan had seized Wake Island in December. The Philippines fell in stages through the spring. Malaya collapsed in 70 days. Singapore, Britain's Gibraltar of the East, defended by 85,000 troops, surrendered on February 15, 1942. In the largest capitulation in British military history, the Dutch East Indies followed. Burma fell. By April, Japanese forces had carved out a perimeter stretching from the borders of India to the islands of the Central Pacific. In that same month, Vice Admiral Chuchi Nagumo led the Kido Butai, Japan's elite carrier striking force, into the Indian Ocean. Off Ceylon, his dive bombers found the British carrier HMS Hermes and the cruisers Dorsetshire and Cornwall. The accuracy was devastating. Japanese pilots placed their bombs with better than 80% precision. The British ships went down in minutes. 6 months of war, 6 months of unbroken victory. Japanese naval aviators had not lost a single engagement. This record bred what Japanese officers themselves would later name. They called it Senshubio victory disease. It was a pathological overconfidence that seeped into planning, intelligence, and assumptions at every level. The evidence was damning. During the Midway planning war games held aboard the battleship Yamato from May 1 through May 4, 1942, Rear Admiral Akagi Matome served as chief umpire. When the officer playing the American side positioned carriers on the Kido Butai's flank and launched a simulated air attack, the dice determined 9 bomb hits, enough to sink both Akagi and Kaga. Akagi declared this result impossible. He arbitrarily reduced the hits to 3. He ruled Akagi only damaged, and he later refloated Kaga for subsequent phases of the exercise. The officer playing the Americans reportedly protested with tears in his eyes. When Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto asked Commander Minoru Genda what would happen if American carriers appeared unexpectedly, Genda replied with a dismissive idiom, "Goishiku." One touch of the armored gauntlet, an effortless victory. The operational plan reflected this arrogance through fatal dispersion. Rather than concentrating overwhelming strength at the point of attack, the Japanese scattered their forces across the Pacific. for fleet carriers would approach Midway from the northwest. Yamamoto's main body, including 3 battleships, would trail 300 miles behind, too far to render any assistance. 2 light carriers were diverted to the Aleutian Islands as a diversionary feint. A separate occupation force approached from the southwest. The Japanese Navy possessed crushing numerical superiority. They chose never to bring it to bear. Perhaps the most consequential symptom of overconfidence was the decision not to include the carrier Zuikaku. She had been undamaged at the Battle of the Coral Sea in May. Her air group had suffered losses, but historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully later demonstrated she could have mustered approximately 56 aircraft, only 7 short of her normal complement, or received replacement squadrons from other carriers. Their conclusion was damning. Zuikaku could have been made available if her presence had been considered vital. The Japanese did not consider it vital. They believed they had already won. The aircraft that would prove them wrong was considered by Japanese standards unworthy of concern. The Douglas SBD Dauntless had been designed by Ed Heinemann at the Douglas Aircraft Company in El Segundo, California. It evolved from the Northrop BT-1 dive bomber program of the mid-1930s when Douglas absorbed Northrop Corporation in 1938. The design was redesignated XSBD-1. The official designation stood for Scout Bomber Douglas. American air crews coined a more fitting backronym, slow but deadly. The SBD-3 variant flown at Midway was powered by a Wright R. 1820-52 Cyclone radial engine producing 1,000 horsepower. Its maximum speed was approximately 250 miles per hour, 80 miles per hour slower than the Mitsubishi A6M0 fighter that would inevitably try to kill it. The Dauntless carried a crew of 2, pilot and rear gunner. Its armament consisted of 2 forward-firing .50 caliber Browning machine guns and twin .30 caliber guns on a flexible rear mount. Standard bomb load was a 1,000 pounds bomb on a centerline displacing yoke plus 2 100 pounds bombs under the wings. On paper, the SBD was a sitting duck, slow, lightly armed, incapable of outrunning anything the Japanese flew. In practice, it was the most lethal anti-ship weapon in the Pacific theater. The secret was its perforated split-flap dive brakes. 318 precisely tapered flanged holes punched through trailing edge flaps that deployed above and below each wing. These brakes had been conceived by NACA engineers to solve severe tail buffeting that had terrified test pilots. Heinemann himself, riding as an observer during development flights, later admitted the original buffeting had scared the hell out of me. The solution transformed the aircraft's lethality. The perforated brakes allowed the SBD to dive at angles between 70 and 75 degrees, while limiting speed to roughly 250 knots. This gave pilots a controlled, stable diving window of 30 to 40 seconds, an eternity to aim, releasing between 1,500 and 2,500 feet. Well-trained dive bomber pilots achieved hit probabilities exceeding 50%. Heinemann had deliberately chosen non-folding wings to maximize structural strength. Dive bombing demanded punishing pullouts of 5 GS or more, and the wings had to survive. The result was an aircraft of extraordinary ruggedness. The statistics told the story. The SBD had the lowest attrition rate of any American carrier aircraft in the war. At the Battle of the Coral Sea, Dauntless shot down approximately 40 Japanese aircraft, more than the F-4F Wildcat fighters escorting them. Over the entire war, the SBD's air-to-air kill ratio reached approximately 3.2 to 1, 138 aerial victories against fewer than 50 losses to enemy fighters. A remarkable record for a bomber. First Lieutenant Daniel Iverson of Marine Squadron VMSB 241 would return to Midway Island after the battle with 219 bullet holes from Zeros and anti-aircraft fire. His SBD was still flying. Total production reached 5,936 aircraft across all variants. Over the course of the Pacific War, the Dauntless sank more than 300,000 tons of enemy shipping, including 6 aircraft carriers, 1 battleship, 14 cruisers, and 6 destroyers, more than any other Allied aircraft type. The Japanese did not know any of this yet. They would learn. The American ambush at Midway was made possible by one of the most consequential intelligence triumphs in military history. Commander Joseph Rockefort led Station Hypo, a cryptanalysis unit housed in a windowless basement at the Pearl Harbor Naval Yard. The space was cramped, poorly ventilated, and perpetually cold from the air conditioning needed to protect the equipment. Rockefort worked in a red smoking jacket and carpet slippers, rarely sleeping, surrounded by stacks of intercepted Japanese radio traffic. His hand-picked team included Chief Cryptanalyst Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, linguist Lieutenant Joseph Finnegan, and Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes. Together, they were attacking JN-25, the Imperial Japanese Navy's primary operational code. It consisted of approximately 33,000 valid 5-digit code groups, superenciphered with additive tables that changed regularly. By May 1942, Hypo was decrypting and analyzing Japanese messages within hours of transmission, processing roughly 140 messages per day. Intercepts increasingly referenced a major operation targeting a location designated AF. Rockefort and Fleet Intelligence Officer Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton believed AF was Midway, Washington's rival code-breaking Unit OP-20G under Commander John Redman disagreed. They insisted the target might be the Aleutian Islands, Port Moresby, or even the American West Coast. To settle the dispute, Holmes proposed a ruse. A message was sent via secure undersea cable to Midway, instructing the garrison to broadcast an uncoded radio report that its water desalination plant had broken down. Within 48 hours, Hypo intercepted a Japanese message reporting that AF is short of water. The ruse did not discover the target Rockefort knew, but it silenced Washington's objections. Admiral Chester Nimitz, trusting his intelligence officers, committed to the ambush. Layton delivered his final prediction on May 27. The Japanese carriers would probably attack on the morning of June 4 from the northwest on a bearing of 325 degrees at a distance of approximately 175 miles from Midway. When initial sighting reports on June 4 confirmed the forecast, Nimitz told Layton with a smile, "Well, you were only 5 minutes, 5 degrees, and 5 miles out." Nimitz ordered emergency repairs on the badly damaged Yorktown. Navy Yard inspectors had estimated 90 days minimum. 1,400 workers completed the job in 72 hours, laboring around the clock. Nimitz positioned all 3 American carriers, Enterprise, Hornet, and the patched-together Yorktown northeast of Midway at a position named Point Luck. They would be waiting on Nagumo's flank, and Nagumo had no idea they were there. The pilots who would fly the mission that morning were not supermen. They were Navy and Marine aviators, most in their 20s, some barely out of flight training, all of them aware that dive-bombing a defended carrier task force was among the most dangerous missions in naval aviation. Lieutenant Commander C. Wade McCluskey, 39 years old, was a fighter pilot by background who had been thrust into command of Enterprise's air group approximately 2 months before the battle. A graduate of the Naval Academy class of 1926, he had spent most of his career flying fighters. He had no experience leading dive bomber strikes against enemy warships. What he possessed was something harder to quantify: sound judgment, the willingness to make hard decisions under pressure, and the kind of quiet competence that made other men willing to follow him into danger. Lieutenant Richard Halsey Best, 32, commanded Bombing Squadron 6 aboard Enterprise. Best was an Annapolis man, class of 1932, who had found his calling in dive bombing. He was a perfectionist who had joined VB6 in 1940 and driven his pilots relentlessly through training exercises in the months before the war. Best believed in precision above all else. He drilled his men until they could place bombs within feet of their aim points. He studied the mechanics of the dive, the physics of the release, the variables that made the difference between a hit and a miss. Best led from the front and expected nothing from his pilots that he would not do himself. He was not well liked by everyone. His intensity rubbed some men the wrong way, but no one doubted his skill or his courage. When the moment came, he would be where the fighting was thickest. Lieutenant Commander Maxwell Franklin Leslie, 39, commanded Bombing Squadron 3 from Yorktown. Leslie was steady, experienced, and respected by his men. He had served in the Navy since 1926 and had spent years developing the skills of carrier aviation. Where Best was intense, Leslie was calm. He led by example and by the confidence his demeanor inspired in others. On the morning of June 4th, he would face a cruel test of that leadership. These 3 men, McCluskey, Best, and Leslie, would make the decisions in the air that determined the battle's outcome. But they could not have succeeded without the sacrifice of others who went before them. The morning of June 4th began with a cascade of events that would funnel toward 5 minutes of destruction. At 4:30, Nagumo launched 108 aircraft against Midway Island. He also dispatched 7 search planes to scout the surrounding ocean, but Tone's No. 4 scout, assigned to search the critical northeast sector where the American fleet waited, launched at least 30 minutes late due to a catapult malfunction. Some historians argue the delay was closer to an hour. At 6:34, Japanese bombers struck Midway. They inflicted significant damage but left the airstrip operational. Starting at 7:05, Midway-based aircraft counterattacked in piecemeal waves: TBF Avengers, B-26 Marauders, Marine SBDs, B-17s, and ancient SB-2U Vindicators. None scored a hit, but the attacks convinced Nagumo that a second strike on the island was necessary. At 7:15, he ordered his reserve aircraft rearmed from anti-ship torpedoes to high-explosive land attack bombs. Then at 7:28, the delayed Tone No. 4 reported American surface ships. The message struck as one Japanese officer later wrote, like a bolt from the blue. Nagumo halted the rearming at 7:45, demanding ship type identification. At 8:20 came the dreaded confirmation. Enemy force accompanied by what appears to be aircraft carrier. Rear Admiral Taman Yamaguchi aboard Hiryu urged immediate launch with whatever ordnance was loaded. Nagumo refused. He chose to recover his returning Midway strike aircraft, low on fuel, some damaged, then properly rearm everything for an anti-ship attack. It was a decision measured in minutes. He could not know he had none to spare. Between 9:20 and 10:24, 3 American torpedo squadrons attacked in succession. They were annihilated. Commander John C. Waldron of Torpedo Squadron 8 had broken formation from the Hornet Air Group, whose commander was navigating on a fatally incorrect heading. Waldron flew independently toward the last known Japanese position and found the enemy fleet. His radio transmission when he sighted the carriers has become one of the most haunting messages of the war. "We will go in. We won't turn back. We will attack." Waldron was 41 years old, a veteran naval aviator who had served in the Navy since 1924. He was part Sioux, fiercely proud of his heritage and utterly devoted to his men. In the days before the battle, he had written a letter to his wife. "I love you and the children very dearly and I long to be with you, but I could not be happier ashore at this time. My place is here with the fight." The night before the attack, Waldron had gathered his pilots. He told them that the squadron's job was to attack. If only one plane was left, that plane would attack. If his plane was shot down, they were to continue without him. "If there is only one plane left to make a final run in," he said, "I want that man to go in and get a hit." His 15 TBD Devastators flew in at barely 100 feet directly into the teeth of the Japanese Combat Air Patrol. The Zeros came down on them like hawks on pigeons. One by one, the Devastators were shot out of the sky. Waldron's plane was among the first to go down, its wings sheared off by cannon fire. All 15 aircraft were destroyed. 29 of 30 crewmen died. The sole survivor was Ensign George H. Gay Jr., who was wounded in the attack, managed to escape his sinking aircraft and floated in the water under a seat cushion for hours. From that impossible vantage point, he watched the rest of the battle unfold around him. The destruction of the torpedo squadrons and then the dive bombers that came down from the sky and changed everything. Torpedo Squadron 6 from Enterprise lost 10 of 14 aircraft, including Squadron Commander Lieutenant Commander Eugene Lindsay. Torpedo Squadron 3 from Yorktown, the only squadron with fighter escort, 6 Wildcats under Lieutenant Commander Jimmy Thatch, lost 10 of 12, including Lieutenant Commander Lance Massey. Thatch, flying desperately to protect the torpedo bombers, debuted the defensive tactic that would bear his name, the Thatch Weave. It was not enough. Nothing was enough against those odds. Of 41 carrier-based torpedo bombers that attacked, 35 were shot down. 0 hits were scored. The TBD Devastator was fatally obsolete. Maximum speed, roughly 206 miles per hour. The Zero could exceed 330. The Devastator carried minimal armor and defensive armament. The Mark 13 torpedo it delivered required release at under 100-foot altitude and 115 knots airspeed, a slow, low approach that made the aircraft a perfect target. The torpedo's reliability was estimated at barely 10%. The torpedo pilots knew their odds. They attacked anyway. Their sacrifice was not meaningless. The successive attacks over nearly 2 hours forced the Japanese carriers to maneuver constantly, preventing the spotting of strike aircraft on flight decks. More critically, the torpedo planes drew every Zero in the combat air patrol down to sea level, where the fighters consumed ammunition and fuel chasing the slow attackers. When the SBD Dauntless arrived at 20,000 foot-minutes later, there was not a single Zero at altitude to intercept them. The Japanese, who lacked radar entirely, it would not be installed on their ships until August, had perhaps 2 minutes of visual warning as the dive bombers tipped over. At approximately 10:22, McCluskey's Enterprise dive bombers and Leslie's Yorktown squadron arrived over the Kido Butai in an uncoordinated but devastating convergence. They had launched at different times from different positions following different routes. McCluskey had departed Enterprise at 7:45 when Admiral Spruance signaled proceed on mission assigned. Leslie had launched from Yorktown around 9 o'clock. Neither knew where the other was. Neither had coordinated with the other. By pure chance or fate or whatever force governs the collisions of history, they arrived within 3 minutes of each other. At the precise moment when every Zero fighter was down at sea level chasing the last of the torpedo bombers. McCluskey had found the fleet by following the wake of the Japanese destroyer Arisher that was racing at flank speed to rejoin the formation after depth charging the American submarine Nautilus. The destroyer's wake pointed like an arrow straight to the carriers. McCluskey followed it, and at 9:55 he saw what he had been searching for. The wakes of the Japanese carriers, white slashes against the blue Pacific, surrounded by the gray shapes of their screening vessels. For carriers, he had found them all. Leslie, leading Yorktown's Bombing Squadron 3, had suffered a cruel equipment failure during the outbound flight. A faulty electrical arming switch accidentally jettisoned his 1,000-pound bomb into the sea. 3 other pilots experienced the same malfunction. 4 of 17 planes were now unarmed. A lesser officer might have turned back. Leslie continued anyway, unarmed, to lead his squadron by example. If he could not drop a bomb, he could still strafe. He could still dive. He could still show his men the target and trust them to do their jobs. What happened next unfolded in approximately 5 minutes. From 20,000 feet, the dive bombers pushed over. The SBD's nose dropped toward the vertical. The perforated dive brakes deployed with a shuddering vibration as the aircraft accelerated into its 70 degrees plunge. Through the bomb sight, the target swelled from a distant shape to a detailed image. Flight deck, island superstructure, aircraft spotted on the deck, the great red rising sun painted amidships. McCluskey pushed over on the nearest carrier, Kaga. Most of his force followed, and 4 to 5 bombs struck home. One hit killed Captain Jisaku Okada instantly when a fuel truck near the bridge exploded. Within seconds, fires swept through the hangar deck, detonating the armed and fueled aircraft stored there. Kaga was doomed. Lieutenant Dick Best saw the error. Standard doctrine called for the air group commander to take the far target while the squadron leader took the near one. This prevented all aircraft from piling onto a single ship. McCluskey, a fighter pilot unfamiliar with dive bombing doctrine, had gone for Kaga. Most of VB-6 followed him. Best had 2 choices. He could follow the crowd and add his bombs to the overkill on Kaga, or he could do what doctrine demanded and strike the second carrier. He chose doctrine. He pulled out of his initial dive, banked hard, and headed for Akagi with only his 2 wingmen, Lieutenant Junior Grade Edwin Kroger and Ensign Frederick Weber. 3 planes against Nagumo's flagship. 3 bombs against the most important ship in the Japanese fleet. At approximately 10:25, Best released. His 1,000-pound bomb struck squarely amidships near the midship elevator. It punched through the flight deck, penetrated to the upper hangar deck, and detonated among 18 fully fueled and armed torpedo bombers that had been waiting there for the counterstrike that would now never come. 1 bomb, 1 carrier doomed. Best later described centering his bomb sight on that big red rising sun painted on the deck. Meanwhile, Leslie's Yorktown squadron dove on Soryu. Though Leslie himself was unarmed, he dove anyway to strafe and to direct his pilots' attacks. His 13 armed pilots followed him down, and 3 direct hits struck along the carrier's length. The bombs penetrated to the hangar deck and set off the same chain reactions of fuel and ordnance that were consuming Akagi and Kaga. Captain Ryosaku Yanagimoto ordered abandon ship within 30 minutes. He refused to leave himself. Crew members who attempted to physically remove him were waved away. Chief Petty Officer Abe was sent to bring the captain to safety. He found Yanagimoto standing alone on the bridge, sword in hand, singing Kimigeo, the Japanese national anthem. He went down with his ship. In 5 minutes, from 10:20 to 10:25, 3 of Japan's 4 fleet carriers had been turned into funeral pyres. For decades, the dominant narrative of Midway centered on what Commander Mitsuo Fukuda called the 5 fateful minutes. Fukuda, who had led the attack on Pearl Harbor and was aboard Akagi during the battle, published his account in 1955. He claimed the Japanese carriers were caught with fully armed and fueled aircraft spotted on their flight decks moments from launching a devastating counterstrike. If the Americans had arrived 5 minutes later, he wrote, the outcome would have been reversed. This narrative dominated English-language histories for half a century. It was dramatic, tragic, and wrong. In 2005, historians Jonathan Parshall and Anthony Tully published Shattered Sword, the untold story of the Battle of Midway using Japanese primary sources never previously examined by Western historians, including Akagi's detailed flight deck logs. They demonstrated that Fukuda's account was fabricated. The flight decks were not loaded with strike aircraft ready to launch. The strike planes were still in the enclosed hangars being rearmed and refueled. Akagi's flight deck logs show continuous combat air patrol cycling, fighters landing and taking off from 8:37 to at least 10:10. This constant activity made it physically impossible for strike aircraft to have been spotted there. Even after the last CAP recovery at approximately 10:10, it would have taken an estimated 40 additional minutes to spot aircraft, warm engines, and launch. The earliest possible Japanese counterstrike would have been 10:50 to 11 o'clock, not 10:25. Parshall stated the conclusion bluntly. Fukuda's entire rendition of the climax of the most important naval battle in American history was a lie. The real vulnerabilities were systemic, not accidental. Removed torpedoes and bombs had been stacked on hangar decks rather than properly restored in magazines. There was simply no time. When American bombs penetrated to the hangar decks, they detonated this loose ordnance, causing catastrophic chain reaction explosions. Japanese carrier design compounded the disaster. Their enclosed hangar decks, unlike American open hangars, trapped blast effects and fumes. Damage control was delegated to line officers rather than trained specialist teams. Firefighting equipment was inadequate. Japan was not undone by 5 minutes of bad luck. Japan was undone by systemic failures of doctrine, design, and organization. Shattered Sword won the John Lyman Award for Best Book in U.S. Naval History. Its conclusions are now the dominant scholarly interpretation. Hiryu survived the morning attack. She was positioned several miles from the other 3 carriers and was not spotted by the American dive bombers. Her air group launched 2 counterstrikes against Yorktown. The first wave of 18 dive bombers scored 3 bomb hits. The second wave of 10 torpedo bombers scored 2 torpedo hits. Yorktown, already damaged at Coral Sea and hastily repaired, was crippled. She would be finished off by a Japanese submarine 2 days later, but Hiryu's survival was brief. At approximately 1700 hours, 24 SBDs from Enterprise found her. 14 of those aircraft were actually orphaned Yorktown planes that had landed on Enterprise after their own ship was disabled. For bombs struck Hiryu. She burned through the night. Rear Admiral Yamaguchi and Captain Tomio Kaku chose to go down with their ship. Yamaguchi was one of the Imperial Japanese Navy's most capable officers. His final message to his crew urged them to continue fighting for Japan. The destroyer scuttled what remained of Hiryu on the morning of June 5. In 24 hours, the Kido Butai had ceased to exist. The casualty accounting reveals Midway's true strategic weight. Japan lost 4 fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, totaling approximately 108,000 tons of displacement. The heavy cruiser Mikuma was sunk on June 6 by SBDs. Roughly 248 aircraft were destroyed. An estimated 3,057 Japanese personnel died. Parshall and Tully's research identified approximately 110 trained aircrew killed, about 25% of the roughly 450 embarked on the 4 carriers. This figure, while significant, challenges the popular narrative that Midway destroyed Japan's pilot corps. The deeper wound was less visible. Over 40% of the carrier's highly trained mechanics, armorers, and flight deck technicians went down with the ships. These men represented irreplaceable organizational knowledge built over years, the institutional memory of how to run a carrier air group. They could not be replaced by any training program. American losses were comparatively modest. Yorktown was torpedoed by submarine I-168 on June 6 and sank June 7. Destroyer Hammond went down alongside her. Approximately 150 aircraft were lost. Roughly 307 Americans died. The strategic mathematics that followed Midway were merciless. Japan entered the war with 6 fleet carriers and 3 light carriers. After losing Shoho at Coral Sea and 4 fleet carriers at Midway, with Shokaku in drydock and Zuikaku's air group depleted, Japan was reduced to 2 operational fleet carriers by July 1942, a 67% reduction in its most critical offensive asset. The Kido Butai, the most powerful concentration of naval aviation in history, had ceased to exist as a coherent force. Japan's pilot training system, designed to produce a small elite over 2 to 3 years with extraordinarily high washout rates, could not scale. The ace Saburo Sakai later recalled that of 1,500 applicants to his training class, 70 were selected and only 25 graduated. The feedback loop was lethal. Losing experienced pilots meant less experienced replacements who died faster, consuming the remaining veterans. Japan never implemented a rotation system. Experienced pilots flew until they were killed, robbing the training pipeline of instructors. American submarine warfare on Japanese oil tankers progressively cut the fuel available for training. By 1944, American pilot training averaged 525 hours, while Japanese training had been slashed to 275 hours. By 1945, some Japanese pilots entered combat with as few as 90 hours. The consequences became visible at the Battle of the Philippine Sea in June 1944, the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot. Japan lost approximately 480 aircraft against 123 American losses, a kill ratio exceeding 12-1. That battle functionally ended Japanese naval aviation as a combat force. The production comparison rendered the outcome inevitable regardless of tactical results. The numbers were not close. They were not even in the same category. Between 1942 and 1945, the United States built 151 aircraft carriers of all types, fleet carriers, light carriers, escort carriers. Japan built 17, a ratio of nearly 9-1. The United States produced approximately 296,000 military aircraft during the war. Japan produced roughly 76,000, a ratio of nearly 4-1. The disparity in carriers was even starker when quality was considered. The Essex-class fleet carriers that would dominate the Pacific from 1943 onward were the finest carriers afloat, fast, well-armored, capable of operating air groups of 90 or more aircraft. 32 were ordered, 24 were completed, 17 entered service during wartime. 14 saw combat. Not a single Essex-class carrier was lost to enemy action during the entire war. The escort carriers, the baby flat tops that escorted convoys and provided close air support, numbered over 120 by war's end. Each one was built in a matter of months, mass-produced like automobiles in the shipyards of Washington, Oregon, and California. In 1944 alone, the United States built more than 96,000 military aircraft, more than Japan produced during the entire war. American factories were running 3 shifts around the clock, 7 days a week. The production lines never stopped. Jonathan Parshall has argued that even a catastrophic American defeat at Midway, all 3 carriers lost, no Japanese losses, would have produced carrier parity by September 1943 and 2:1 American superiority by mid-1944. The industrial tide was irresistible. Midway did not determine whether America would win. It determined how quickly America would win and how many men would die in the winning. Japan's wartime carrier construction told the inverse story of a nation running out of everything: steel, aluminum, fuel, trained workers, time. Taiho, the armored carrier meant to be unsinkable, was commissioned in March 1944. She was sunk 3 months later by a single torpedo from submarine albacore at the Battle of the Philippine Sea. A design flaw had placed aviation fuel tanks in vulnerable positions, and poor damage control, the decision to open ventilation systems to clear fumes, spread volatile gases throughout the ship. What should have been a survivable hit became a catastrophic explosion. Shinano, the converted Yamato-class battleship hull, the largest aircraft carrier ever built at that time, displacing 65,800 tons standard, was commissioned on November 19, 1944. She was sunk 10 days later by submarine Archerfish. Shinano never operated a single aircraft. She never launched a single plane. She sailed on her maiden voyage and died before she ever fought. By late 1944, the Japanese were building ships they could not man, training pilots they could not supply with fuel, fighting a war they could not win. The arithmetic had been set in motion on the morning of June 4, 1942. Everything that followed was consequence. Post-war interrogations by the United States Strategic Bombing Survey captured candid Japanese assessments. Rear Admiral Toshitane Takato stated the main reason for the failure was the strategic inefficiency on the side of the Japanese Navy, careless mishandling of the Japanese Navy. He confirmed that Midway prompted an urgent overhaul of scouting doctrine. After this Battle of Midway, they put more emphasis on search training. Asked when he first believed Japan would lose the war, Takata answered, "First inkling came when Japan lost its carriers at Midway, and when I observed Japanese Air Force could not cope with American Air Forces in the Solomons." Commander Hashimoto Ohara, executive officer of Soryu, confirmed the intelligence failure. "No, we had no information until we were attacked by dive bombers. Then we thought that they had come from Midway." He did not realize carrier-based aircraft had attacked until after the battle was over. Captain Yasuji Watanabe of Yamamoto's staff blamed the carrier force for failing to maintain sufficient caution and search of the area. The men who had believed in Geiu Ishiku, the effortless victory, were forced to explain how 4 carriers had been destroyed in a single morning. One famous quote about Japanese attitudes deserves correction. Admiral Yamamoto is widely credited with saying after Pearl Harbor, "I fear all we have done is to awaken a sleeping giant and fill him with a terrible resolve." He never said it. The line first appeared in the 1970 film Tora, Tora, Tora. Screenwriter Larry Forrester claimed to have found it in a Japanese letter, but he could never produce the document. Military historian Steve Gillen of the University of Oklahoma has confirmed, "As far as I know, we have no evidence that Yamamoto ever made the observation." What Yamamoto actually wrote in a verified letter dated January 9, 1942 to Agata Takuro of the Asahi Shimbun was more measured, but equally foreboding. A military man can scarcely pride himself on having smitten a sleeping enemy. It is more a matter of shame simply for the one smitten. And before the war he had told Japanese schoolchildren, "It is a mistake to regard the Americans as luxury-loving and weak. I can tell you Americans are full of the spirit of justice, fight, and adventure." Yamamoto understood the danger. His subordinates did not. The man most responsible for the American victory at Midway received punishment rather than reward. Commander Joseph Rockefort had broken the Japanese code, identified the target, and given Nimitz the intelligence that made the ambush possible. In doing so, he had circumvented Washington and made enemies of rival codebreakers who resented his methods and his success. After Midway, Rockefort was relieved of command at Station Hypo and assigned to oversee construction of a floating dry dock in San Francisco. It was a punitive assignment, and everyone in the intelligence community knew it. Admiral Ernest King vetoed Nimitz's recommendation that Rockefort receive the Navy Distinguished Service Medal. The recognition Rockefort deserved was blocked by the men whose authority he had challenged. Rockefort never sought public credit. Above his desk hung a sign, "We can accomplish anything, provided no one cares who gets the credit." He died in 1976. The Distinguished Service Medal was finally approved in 1985 and presented by President Reagan in 1986, 43 years after the battle. Lieutenant Dick Best paid for his courage with his health. On the afternoon of June 4th, after destroying Akagi in the morning attack, Best flew again. He scored at least one hit on Hiryu, making him the only pilot to bomb 2 Japanese carriers in a single day. But something was wrong. During the morning mission, a defective oxygen canister in his SBD's breathing system had malfunctioned. The soda lime used to scrub carbon dioxide had produced caustic sodium hydroxide fumes. Best had inhaled them throughout the dive and recovery. The fumes severely damaged his respiratory system. They activated latent tuberculosis that had been dormant for years. Best was hospitalized shortly after returning to Pearl Harbor. He was medically retired in 1944 at the rank of lieutenant commander with 100% disability. He was 34 years old. The pilot who had destroyed Nagumo's flagship with a single bomb would never fly in combat again. Midway did not decide the Pacific War's ultimate outcome. American industrial supremacy made that inevitable. What Midway decided was timing and cost. And in war, timing and cost are everything. By destroying the Keto Butai's offensive capability in a single morning, the dive bombers bought the United States 6 to 12 critical months to convert industrial potential into deployed military power, 6 months in which the new carriers could be built, 6 months in which the new pilots could be trained, 6 months in which the factories could run 3 shifts and the shipyards could work around the clock. Within 2 months of Midway, Marines landed on Guadalcanal, the first American offensive of the Pacific War. It was a close-run thing. The naval battles around Guadalcanal in late 1942 were among the most desperate of the entire war. Both sides lost heavily, but America could replace its losses and Japan could not. Within 18 months of Midway, Essex-class carriers were arriving at a pace Japan could never match. Within 2 years, American carrier task forces were ranging across the Pacific at will, striking where they chose, when they chose. The Marianas, the Philippines, Iwo Jima, Okinawa. The Japanese had believed their pilots were superior. They had believed their tactics were unbeatable. They had believed their fighting spirit would overcome American material. They had believed the Americans were soft, undisciplined, luxury-loving, and incapable of matching Japanese resolve. At 10:25 on the morning of June 4, 1942, Dick Best's single bomb ended that belief forever. The grinding attrition of the Solomons campaign through late 1942 and 1943 finished what Midway started. The veteran Japanese air crews who had swept through the Pacific in the war's first months were consumed in battle after battle, Guadalcanal, Santa Cruz, the slot. By 1944, the elite pilots who had attacked Pearl Harbor and destroyed Force Z and raided the Indian Ocean were gone, replaced by half-trained replacements who could not match their predecessors. What Midway proved was something the Japanese high command had refused to believe, that American courage, American skill, and American determination could match anything Japan could field. The battle's most important lesson concerns the relationship between systemic failure and catastrophic surprise. The Japanese defeat was not a matter of 5 unlucky minutes. It was the inevitable result of arrogance that infected war planning, of war games that produced scripted results, of intelligence systems that sailed blind while the enemy read their mail. It was the result of doctrine that could not adapt under pressure, of carrier designs that turned enclosed hangar decks into bomb traps, of damage control delegated to line officers instead of trained specialists, of a training pipeline built for peacetime perfection rather than wartime attrition. The SBD Dauntless, slow, unglamorous, dismissed, was simply the instrument that exposed these fractures. Every system the Japanese had built was optimized for the victories they had already won. None of it was designed for what happened when they finally faced an enemy who hit back. The men who flew at Midway are nearly all gone now. The last survivors of Torpedo Squadron 8 and Bombing Squadron 6 and the other units that attacked on June 4th have passed into history. George Gay, the sole survivor of VT-8, died in 1994. Dick Best, the pilot who sank 2 carriers in one day, died in 2001, his lungs still scarred by the caustic fumes he had inhaled 60 years before. What remains is the record of what they did. McCluskey running on fumes over an empty ocean, making the decision to turn northwest when every instinct said go home. Waldron leading his men toward certain death because the torpedo had to be delivered. The mission had to be flown. The sacrifice had to be made. Best recognizing a mistake in the chaos of combat, pulling out of his dive, banking toward Akagi with only 2 wingmen behind him. Leslie, unarmed but unwilling to abandon his men, diving on Soryu to show them the way. The rear gunners and radio men who rode along in the back seats of those Dauntless, unable to control their fate, trusting the men in front to make the right calls. The mechanics and ordnance men who had armed those bombs and fueled those planes in the pre-dawn darkness. The codebreakers in their basement who had given Nimitz the information he needed. None of them knew in the moment what they were part of. None of them could see as they dove through anti-aircraft fire or watched their squadron mates fall into the sea that they were participating in a pivot point of history. They were naval aviators doing their jobs, making decisions in seconds, trusting their training, their aircraft, and each other. The Japanese had built the most powerful carrier force in the world. They had staffed it with the best-trained pilots of any navy. They had sailed it toward Midway, believing that victory was guaranteed, that American air power was contemptible, that American pilots were inferior, that the slow but deadly Dauntless was nothing to fear. In 5 minutes they learned otherwise and the world changed.